such a time as this.
And welcome back to For Such a Time as This. I'm your host, Pastor James Pittman, here again with our weekly installment with Don Veinot, president of Midwest Outreach. Don, today we're going to talk about the mystery of life. Enlighten us on the mystery of life.
Well, it is a mystery indeed. We're not really talking about the mystery of trying to figure out women. I don't think we can do that.
That's impossible.
It is impossible. Someone gave me a book. It was all men understand about women, and it was about 200 pages, all blank. I don't get it.
Yeah, that's about right.
No, actually, it's a more of a scientific issue. Mm-hmm. How did life originate? It's the mystery question. How did life originate? Mm-hmm. And ultimately, you have two options. One is a metaphysical, i.e., God brought everything into existence. The other is an attempt at calling itself science, but it actually is another religion. And it goes under the scientific name of Abiogenesis. In fact, I was on a trip to New Orleans a couple of weeks ago. You might remember I was at a conference in New Orleans, and on the plane I had a young couple sitting next to me. They had been raised in the Christian church, had abandoned the church because they didn't seem to find reasons for God. They asked difficult questions of their pastors, and they didn't really have any answers, and had really gravitated toward a Darwinian view of life. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And so I overcame my natural shyness. As you might know, I'm kind of naturally shy. And I asked them, a few questions just to make sure we're talking about the same thing. And a friend of mine kind of starts out a discussion like this, asking people he's talking to, what do you think of Alexander Oparin's treatment of abiogenesis? And almost without exception, they look at him and go, who's Alexander Oparin? Yeah, it's a name that, you're not really familiar with. It's not sort of bandied about in your everyday conversation. Well, as it happens, he was a Russian scientist who developed a theory called abiogenesis. And that is the idea that early on in the planet's formation, there was what we'll call a primordial soup. And in this primordial soup, it began sloshing around and being mixed up, and lightning was introduced into the mixture. And from that lightning, 21 amino acids just sort of popped into existence. And those 21 amino acids not only popped into existence, but they clung together and they said, hey, let's have a cell group. And so that was the spark of life. And from that, all of life as we know it, not just humans, but plants, trees, flowers, sea life, everything came from that one spark of life. Simple cells, they were called by Darwin. As we now know, they aren't simple. They're in fact highly complex. Each cell is a little mini factory.
No cell is
comprised of lots of moving parts that assemble and disassemble and move around and reassemble to create other things along the way. It's very complicated. And so as I kind of described that to this young couple, the guy said, well, they've created life in the laboratory. And I said, well, before we debate whether that's true or not, let me ask you some questions about the claim. Did they design an experiment based on what they thought the original primordial soup was like and what it contained? In other words, is there design involved? Did the ones who designed the experiment consider themselves intelligent or unintelligent? I guess that would be my next question. And how did they come to a conclusion that life had began? Or did they just walk into a lab one day and find it already there? And he kind of laughed. He said, well, no, they were intelligent. And they designed the experiment and got it along. And I said, okay. So what you're really arguing then is my view is correct, that you have to have an intelligent designer that designs it and guides it along the process to even get life to begin with. He said,
Exactly.
that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that before.
Yeah.
So that enables us to kind of talk about other alternatives, because really, for a Darwinist, there is only one game in town. There is only abiogenesis, because they have no other way to explain how things got here. Now, there's some great videos online by a scientist by the name of James Tour. I really like him a lot.
Mm-hmm.
He's with the Discovery Institute, and some want to argue that while the Discovery Institute is a intelligent design organization, it's Christian driven, and so forth and so on. And I explain, okay, let's assume all of that is true, but you should know not everyone at the Discovery Institute is a Christian. David Berlinski, for example, really smart guy, has his doubts about Darwinian evolution, finds no scientific data to support this view in particular, and he's agnostic. He's not even a theist. He's agnostic on the idea of God. So it would be wrong to say that just because the Discovery Institute is a Christian idea. They're dealing with a whole different question, and that is the mystery of origins. How did life get here? Now, I'm going to try to do this. We did this almost successfully before we started, but I picked up something from James Tour's presentation, which I think really helps us to key in on this.
Okay.
And that is how these life experiments work. He points out, do you see that now? Sure.
Nope. Yep. You're good. There you go.
There we go. Okay. Almost every chemical synthesis experiment in origin of life, or OOL, research can be summed up used by a protocol analogous to this. Now, follow these steps. These are very important. They purchase some chemicals, generally high purity, from where? Well, from a chemical company, somebody who produced the product to begin with. They mix the chemicals together in water in high concentrations or in a specific order under some set of carefully devised conditions in where? A modern laboratory. So it is designed and guided. Obtain a mixture of compounds that have a resemblance to one or more of the basic 4 classes of chemicals needed for life: carbohydrates, nucleic acids, amino acids, or lipids. Then they publish a paper and claim bold things about their experiment. From these functionless, crude mixtures of sterile chemically scrambled intermediates, like Miller did in 1952. That's the experiment I alluded to a few moments earlier. Just because they have mixed some chemicals together isn't the same thing as they've created life. They exchange with an ever gullible press to dial up the knob of unjustified extrapolation. In other words, they do this experiment, they mix a new brand of chemicals, and they go, see, we almost have life. And the press goes mad over this. And then laypersons exclaim, you see, scientists understand how life formed, when in fact they don't. They encourage a generation of science textbook writers to make colorful, deceptive cartoons of raw chemicals assembling into cells, which then emerge as slithering creatures from a prehistoric pond. So it is a story, is what it is.
Fiction.
It's fiction. It
Pure
is
fiction.
A religion. It's a religion.
But you have to do that. If I want to deny that God is real, I have to come up with an alternative theory. Because to concede the origins as being begun by an almighty God, now I'm morally accountable to an almighty God. So they come up with fictions and stories and religions.
Well, they do come up with a fiction. But it's a religion. It's not that the people are unintelligent. I would suggest, and you and I have talked about this before, and one of the things I often have to do when I go and teach on cults and non-Christian groups is something really, really fundamental. When you're going to talk to anybody about a belief system they have, almost the first thing you have to ask them is about their investment. Now, what I mean by that is this. What is it that attracted them to that? How have they built their life on this idea? And what will it cost them to walk away from it? That's their investment. And
so, again, whenever I talk to someone about evolution and this topic, I piggybacking on what you say, I go to the source, the reason. Why are we even having this conversation? What do you get out of believing this belief system or having this belief system? And then I often bypass the conversation, depend on where it is. If I can prove to your satisfaction that the Christian worldview is true, will you then convert and submit to the Almighty God? If I can prove to you logically that it exists. And it's almost, you get the eyes going down and head shaking. Well, no, not really. Because that's the end game. They can't believe it because then I'm morally accountable. Don, last word.
Well, the last word is, I think Romans chapter 1 really addresses this well, is it says that they see just from creation that something exists beyond them, that God exists.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't tell you what kind of a God, it just tells you that God exists, because
Correct.
from nothing, as Maria sings in Sound of Music, nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever will. We know that. I mean, that is scientifically provable.
Sure.
That from nothing, nothing comes.
Sure.
And so they know that something exists beyond them, but they have to hold on to this fiction for some other reason that they're invested in. And that is that they don't want to confess God exists, because then they would indeed be morally accountable to him, and they don't want that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Don at Midwest Outreach. We'll put those links in the description of the video. Until next week, God bless.
For such a time as this,